So, namaskar, friends, one last time. And we are into the last lecture of this course on the fiction of Indian diaspora. All through, we have been discussing the different aspects of Indian diaspora. What I intend to do in this class is recapitulating the course so that we can all remind ourselves how we started, how did we progress, and then what have we achieved. So, friends, if you remember, the initial classes in the first week were dedicated to the understanding of uh, diaspora, its meaning, definition, its journey through the ages, uh, development. We also try to make sense of the characteristic features of diaspora. We talked about diaspora literature and narrative techniques that are employed by the writers belonging to the diaspora. And we also talked about the challenges and opportunities in diaspora. We had both specific and general discussions on the topic so that broader audience uh, can understand the intricacies of diaspora. In the second week, we started talking about Indian diaspora, and we tried to trace its historical roots, its demographic distribution, and the language, identity, and heritage, socio-economic and political aspects of Indian diaspora, and we tried to see it in its uh, bigger parlance. How does it affect uh, the both the countries, the host and the home country, and how has it affected uh, life back in India, and what kind of connect, emotional or otherwise, the diasporic community maintains with the homeland. In week 3, we talked about the phases of Indian diaspora, in which we talked about the ancient Indian diaspora, and we tried to see how people have been crossing borders since ages for different purposes, and there have been different pull and push factors contributing to that. So, ancient diasporas mostly consisted of people who crossed their boundaries for trade and commerce, or for uh, propagation of their religious ideas, uh, or for some cultural purposes as well. And then we talked about the colonial diaspora, and during the colonial period we found that with the evolution of slavery, the colonial masters needed cheap labor, and as a result Indians were forced to join them and work in plantation economies in Africa, in the Caribbean islands, and many other places. And as a result, the Indians, popularly known as Girmitias, were taken to far off regions of the world, and they form part of indentured. But not only that, during that period we also found that many people also cross the threshold, uh, you know uh, on their own for finding better opportunities for trade and commerce as well. And then, of course, we talked about the contemporary or post colonial diaspora, where we find that it is mostly uh, free diaspora, not forced diaspora, where we find a lot of people, going to other countries in search of better job opportunities, prosperity, and success. So, we talked about the phases of Indian diaspora. We also talked about the government initiatives like NRI Day, celebration of No India programs, and many such cultural and political initiatives by the government of India to facilitate a you know, uh, smooth relationship between the diasporic community and home, which has resulted in better communication between the communities abroad and the communities back home. And many of these government initiatives are commendable because they have been able to, uh, establish a kind of emotional bridge and cultural connect between the diasporic community and home. Then we also talked about the rise of the fiction of Indian diaspora. Well, we need to understand that the people who are living abroad and have been suffering acute sense of nostalgia or alienation, their strong missing of their country, their sense of nostalgia results in expressing themselves in the form of, poetry or fiction or stories. And so if we look at the rise of fiction of Indian diaspora, this is permeated by the experiences of the people belonging to Indian diaspora living abroad. And this also includes the classical diaspora or the colonial Indian diaspora alongside the contemporary diaspora. These diasporic writers adopt many narrative techniques that suit their purpose, since most of these narratives are based on memory. We find a narrative technique that is more unconventional or non-linear, we can say, where past and present, desire and reality, they are mixing in unbroken fashion, giving us a melee of experiences. So in week 3 we talked about this. In week 4 and 5 we basically tried to look at the theoretical formations around diaspora. So we talked about the theories propounded by the famous foremost diasporic critics like Homi K. Bhava. We talked about hybridity, ambivalence, mimicry, and third space. We also talked about Edward Said and his Orientalism and how does it relate to diasporic condition. We talked about Azaz Ahmad, Franz Fanon, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Vijay Mishra, Sudesh Mishra, cultural critics like Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, James Clifford, William Safran, Stephen Wertwick, Ray Chow, and Othar Bara. And we try to form a theoretical understanding of the whole process of diaspora. How does it affect the individuals, communities, cultures, and the geographies of both the home country and the host country? And these formulations at a later stage helped us understand and decode the diasporic reality as embedded in the creative writings by the fiction writers of Indian diaspora. In week 6 and 7, we talked about the key terms and concepts that are related to diaspora, like melting pot, cultural mosaic, salad bowl, transnationalism, and unhomely. We also talked about digital diaspora, and then we discussed two novels by one of the most important and we can say he is the first known novelist of Indian diaspora, V.S. Naipaul. We discussed his novel House for Mr. Biswas, which is considered an epic of diasporic experience and a frame narrative in a free state. And then we also discussed Kamla Markande's The Nowhere Man, a very strong diasporic narrative. In week 8 and 9, we talked about Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children and Moore's Last Sigh, Anita Desai's Bye Bye Blackbird, and Baumgartner's Bombay, and Bharati Mukherjee's Jasmine and Desirable Daughters. All very important milestones, we can say, in the exploration of diasporic experience. Week 10, 11, and 12, we further, discussed some more contemporary diasporic writers like Jhumpa Lahiri's, her The Namesake and Interpreter of Melodies, Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni's Arranged Marriage and The Mistress of Spices, Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss, Rohinton Mysteries, Such a Long Journey and a Fine Balance, and Anita Nair's Lessons in Forgetting. So, all together in this course, we have uh, tried to cover um, all the important novelists and voices emerging out of Indian diaspora, starting with V.S. Naipaul. As I said, uh, he is considered the most important and the first major novelist of Indian diaspora. Then novelists like Salman Rushdie, Bharati Mukherjee, uh, Anita Desai, Jhumpa Lahiri, Deva Karuni, they're all very important names. And today, in the last class, prior to this, we discussed three contemporary novelists who have contributed significantly, and we try to see how uh, our march of diasporic journey with the fantastic storytelling continues, and the preoccupations are also continuing. So we talked about, in between we also talked about MG Basanji, um, who is an example of double diaspora. His family migrated from Gujarat to Kenya, where he was born and raised, and later on he moved from Kenya to Canada. And so we discussed the in between world of Bikram Lal, which in a way was symbolic of the journey of the writer himself. And then Amitabh Ghosh, who to me is one of the most cosmopolitan and universal voices when it comes to talking about displacement, um, unhoming, and the diasporic experiences of loss. And we discussed his The Circle of Reason, his first novel. Mina Alexander, who is otherwise better known as a poet, has left couple of wonderful novels, out of which we discussed Manhattan Music, again a very important novel, um, talking about diasporic experience. In the second last class today, just prior to this class, we talked about Benny Daniels' Goat Days, set in the Gulf countries, and that we will also get to know the diasporic stories coming from our migrations to the Gulf countries. Bikram Chandra's Red Earth and Pouring Rain, and Sanjana Satyan's The Gold Diggers. So this, concluded our 12-week journey, in which we tried to cover almost everything that is required to facilitate our proper understanding of the process of diaspora. So, friends, I'm really very happy, and I thank you all for your kind company throughout this uh, journey. And I hope that you have found real insight into the process of diaspora and the world of the fiction of Indian diaspora through these discussions. I'll be very happy if you join this course, and we further discuss these uh, themes that we have discussed, uh, sometime even in person. So thank you very much for your kind company, and that's all. Thank you.